one of the co-leads for the Sir Bobby Robson Cancer Trials Design Team, working alongside James. I'm also heavily involved in the clinical trials unit where I'm deputy lead, and I also do some work for the research design team. So I guess you could say that I pop up a lot, which is the case, I think, for a few of us here today. So I was going to talk to you today about writing successful funding applications for trials. And I'm going to, if it moves across to the next slide. Oh, it is. So I'm going to work through a few things, some of which have been covered already today, including this slide, which is certainly proving to be the most popular slide today. But as I think we've got some feedback. Is anyone else having the feedback issue? No.
Yeah.
We just check that everybody's still on mute. That'd be great. Thank you.
Thank you. So as a number of the talks already have alluded to, there's an awful lot that goes into developing a robust clinical trial application, seeking funding. The design is clearly an absolutely critical element of that, but there's a number of different elements that go into that, including the very important element of actually writing the story, of writing and crafting the application. We included a useful reference. This is the Research Funding Toolkit, in case anyone is planning one of these or planning to write a proposal and wants to do some additional reading. So I'm just going to today talk through trial and design very, very briefly. I know it's been discussed a lot already. Some information about how we might build appropriate teams to actually help to design and deliver applications. Continuing the theme about involving patients and carers in the research and the research process, identifying appropriate funding sources and the actual resources needed to deliver the trial that is being developed with a plan to run it. Some information about grantsmanship, and then thinking through a little bit about who to involve in the process to get to the point at which you're ready to submit an application. So we've already talked today, James and Dawn have talked very clearly about clinical trials and designs of clinical trials. And it's just making sure that we continue to understand that this is often an evolution. It takes quite a long time to develop the design of a trial, and it involves lots of different elements around what the outcome is, what the intervention is, thinking through the group that's going to be involved in the study, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute, and thinking through sample size, recruitment and retention issues, and as James talked about earlier, methods to avoid bias. There are other things that you might want to consider depending on the stage of the trial. So for example, if health economic analysis evaluations are important, so investigating cost effectiveness might come into conversations. And depending on the stage of the trial and what you're doing, it may be that a mixed methods or a qualitative study alongside the trial might be appropriate to include. So one really important part of running trials and developing trials is understanding that it really is a team game, and it requires a comprehensive, essentially, package of skills to be able to develop and run a trial. And this needs to become really clear in the application form. So first of all, you need a lead for a clinical trial, and that person needs to, is called the principal investigator, and it's making sure that the principal investigator has the level of seniority and track record that is going to be appropriate to gain funding. And there are lots of examples of where maybe more junior principal investigators build a team that includes a more senior investigator to be there in perhaps a mentoring capacity to help them as they go through this potential first clinical trial that they might be running. Clinical trials units often heavily involved in the development and running of clinical trials. The clue, I guess, is in the title there. But it's making sure that if you are running a clinical trial, that you do consider involving a clinical trials unit in that application process, in that development process, and obviously there to then help with the delivery of the trial as well. You'll need to, in an application, comment on the experience of the team. So making sure that you've got an appropriately multidisciplinary team to undertake all of the elements of the trial that are needed. So particular focus will be on statistical support. If you've got health economic elements to your application, then you will need to involve a health economist. If you're looking at doing qualitative work, you would need a qualitative researcher within the team. So it's about making sure that you build the right team for the proposal that you've got and for the trial that you've got. There is a growing move to involve patients in trials more generally, but also occasionally we see that patients also become part of the research team themselves. And I know that Joe Lally, who's here on the call today, is very happy to talk to people in more detail about that. But public involvement, when patients become part of a research team, it needs to be wider than maybe they need to have a particular and specific role within the research team. So a little bit more about involving patients. So we know that the NIHR in particular have championed the involvement of patients throughout the research life cycle. And that's something that is also other funders are now requiring and requesting as norm. And when you write your application, it's important to both have involved them and actively involve them in potentially identifying the research topic or prioritising research questions, but to be able to put into the application and tell the funder that you have done so. If they are involved, it's important to involve them in all the elements that that you can. So getting them to read through and comment and in some cases even write parts of things like the plain English summary. I think that it's also important to think through how patients will be involved right throughout a trial as well. So we often involve patients on trial oversight committees, but they will also be patients that are involved in different ways depending on the different needs of the trials and the particular patient population that's involved. And in your application, I think one of the things that would be very, very important is if you aren't going to involve patients for a reason, then it's going to be important that you tell the funder why you don't think that that's a necessary step. I think there would be very, very few projects, in fact none that I can think of in recent years, where we would be explaining why they're not involved, because we would always have included them. A little bit about the NIHR Include project. So Helen, James and myself actually all sit on the NIHR Include project oversight group, so the oversight committee. And this has been a project looking at how we can provide guidance to help in the designing of trials that will enable underserved groups to actually be included in the research process and also to participate in research. And there are a number of funders that are now starting to, you'll notice the word underserved groups coming into the language around trials and into trial applications. And it's very much around being very specific to the trial in question. So it could be that there's potentially an age barrier or an age limit on the trial that actually means that there's a group of patients that aren't able to access the opportunity to take part in the research. So it's about making sure that populations related to trials are as broad as possible. And it may be, for example, that you are running a trial where you're planning, where an underserved group for that particular trial might live rurally. And it might be as simple as making sure that you include adequate resource to allow those patients to travel in to take part in the research in local hospitals. An important part of developing a trial is making sure that you're choosing the right funder in which from where you're going to get the money, hopefully, to run your trial. So the right funding source for the trial you're planning. And it's going to be a match of the trial that you're planning with the funder needs and the priorities of different funders. And it may be that there's some looking around to be done to make sure that you're targeting an appropriate funder for the research you're planning. And you can do this. There's lots and lots of information out there about on funder websites, and obviously through the Research Design Service and the Sir Bobby Robson team, we can also help to link you to a funder. It's important that you understand the funder that you're targeting, that you read the guidance they have. Some of this can involve looking at previously funded projects to see that the sort of thing you're planning fits with the sorts of projects that they have recently funded or have funded in the past. And we would say that if things aren't clear, that's the opportunity to potentially contact a funder where something within your application may not fit, because it may be that you need to make alterations, or that you need to potentially seek another funder if actually what you're planning is out of their remit. And it's important as part of this that you understand the actual process for applying, whether it's a one-stage, a two-stage application, and what's involved. So when you're writing your grant, it's critical that you understand the audience of the panel in which you're, or who you're writing your application for. And that is going to depend on who the funder is. And so we know that there's likely to be content experts, so someone who is an expert in the field of the application. Then usually referees, so there would be a referee process, but it may be that the funding panel also includes experts in the area. But it will also invariably involve, a panel will also involve non-content experts, so they might have methodological expertise or broader research expertise. And so it's important that when you're writing, you're aware of the audience that you're going to, and you write in a way that is accessible to those groups. Particularly with the NIHR, they also include patients on the panel, so making sure that you write really clearly and in a manner that would be accessible is important. So when you write a grant, it's important that you're selling a story, that you're telling a story about your research, your proposal, and particularly following this sort of storyline, the importance. What is it about this question that is important to patients, to the public, to the NHS, and also marrying that up with those funder priorities that I mentioned earlier. So this is about ensuring that you understand the scale and the burden of the problem. And then you need to talk through and think through the success. So what is it in this trial and how is it that this trial will robustly answer the research question and fill that evidence gap? And it's also about making sure that the methods, and that's about the design, the trial design, will successfully answer the question being posed. Another important element of this is about value for money. I'll talk a little bit about budget in a few minutes, but making sure that you request the funding needed to match what you're planning to do within the trial. And then finally, it's about competence. And this is about making sure that you are able to sell the idea that you are a team that can deliver this trial, that actually what you're doing is feasible, and that's slightly different to a feasibility trial, but actually that you've got all the elements together to actually conduct the trial in question. So you've got some additional tools at your disposal when you're thinking about conveying the story to the audience. The title is incredibly important of your proposed trial. And it's actually something that needs to be revisited a number of times, because a trial will evolve, and making sure that you constantly you do go back and check that the title that you have marries up with the final design and the final plan for your trial is going to be very, very important. making sure that actually you have undertaken a very thorough look at the existing evidence. So looking at all the primary literature, looking at systematic reviews, but also including other things such as grey literature, policy documents, NICE guidance, and also any existing data sets that you may have access to. And this could also include some audit work. And as Dawn has mentioned earlier, being clear about what findings from pilot and feasibility work tell you. It's important that you, oh, I'm sorry, gone one slide too far. Develop this in a really comprehensive and coherent way. There's often not a huge amount of space in an application form, so it's very important that you put all of this together in a concise way. And this may mean that you also have to acknowledge that the knowns and the unknowns related to this work. I've talked a little bit about this already, but making sure that you're very clear about what the problem is that's being addressed and what its impact, what the impact of this research is going to be. How will this fill the evidence gap? And also talking through about why a trial is needed now. And it's important to be able to say that the results of this trial will also still be applicable when the trial finishes, because sometimes, you know, evidence moves on, there might be other trials being run, and it's important that you have an understanding of those and are able to tell the funder that. It's important that you talk through comprehensively a project plan, so making sure your aims and objectives are clear, your methods, your design, PICO, as James talked about earlier, but also thinking through any governance related issues, making sure that there are ethical issues that might have been addressed, regulatory if you're working in drug trials or in device trials, then thinking through any regulatory barriers, making sure that you've got access to the drugs that, for example, that are going to be used in the trial is important, and that there's a team in place to actually deliver the trial. The final part of that is making sure that the timelines are very, very clear, that you've left enough time within your project plan to undertake all the elements of the trial, including the setup and the analysis. These are often elements that get squeezed, but funders find these pretty quickly. Sorting out the budget takes time, and it's something that needs to be thought about early, and you need to be very realistic about costing. And there's a link here to some costing guidelines, but making sure you involve all the elements. So if you've got a CTU team, statistics teams, health economics, research costs on the ground, co-investigators, all of those costs need to be comprehensively included. We've talked about feasibility trials, and I mentioned a little bit about feasibility, and making sure that you demonstrate in your application that that you understand likely recruitment rates. These might be evidence from earlier trials that you've run or from trials that have been run in similar areas. Making sure that you've got timelines, that is clear, and also thinking through that the team have the right track record to actually complete the trial in question. Final few slides from me, because I'm recognising that time is running short here. So making sure that you have a thorough understanding of what the impact of this research will be, who your main stakeholders are, and how you can get the information, the research findings out to as wide an audience as possible, as quickly as possible. And it may be that some of those stakeholders that you identify for the end of the trial maybe need to be brought in earlier to help to shape the proposal. A little bit about grantsmanship, making sure that actually when you complete applications, that you complete them for that particular funder, and you include all the sections that the funder requires. Making sure that messages you have in there are very, very clear about the importance and how you plan to address this. Make sure you use things like consistent terminology and you don't overcomplicate things. And importantly, that you proofread. It's amazing how many errors can creep in and requires quite a lot of final review. The time factor, we know that James mentioned earlier that good proposals that have the best chance of funding do take time, and we encourage everyone to think through and spend the time developing a good proposal. It's usually around about 6 months from idea to the point at which you might be submitting a proposal to a funder, but it can be longer than that if needed. There are lots of people that need to be involved in developing a research proposal, including the sponsor, making sure you've got assurance, the full research team, and it's important to make sure they've been included. And I think finally, just from me, just to say that I know that can seem a little bit daunting. There's lots to do, there's lots to think about, but we are here to help through the Research Design Service and through the Sir Bobby Robson Cancer Trials Design team. Thank you.